So our reading today is from the book called Fathiest, How an Atheist Found Common Ground with the Religious by Chris Stedman. And this is actually the beginning of the book. He writes, I had never heard the word Fathiest before, but I was pretty sure it wasn't a compliment. Yes, he said without inflection, there's nothing worse than a Fathiest. It was my first experience with the atheist movement, and for at least a moment I thought it might be my last. I'd been an atheist for a while, but I had hesitated to seek out a community of non-religious people. I imagined that secular folks would be difficult to organize, that assembling atheists and agnostics and skeptics and free thinkers and other non-religious individuals would provide tricky, because our common thread that we are not something underscores only what we do not believe. But as I progressed in my work as an interfaith activist, I noticed that one of the things that actually made people good at it was a groundedness in one's own identity. That, paired with my longing for a community of common belief, led me begin searching for an organized community of non-theists. The brusque brush-off occurred at a reception following a public discussion organized by a non-religious group. The topic had been how the non-religious, more specifically atheists, agnostics, and other non-theistic, non-religious people should approach religion. I had suspected that there would be mixed feelings about religion. After all, I knew of the popular atheist discourse on the subject, which cast the religious not only as incorrect about metaphysical realities, but as standing in the way of social and intellectual progress. But I had also hoped that someone might offer a more balanced perspective on religion, locating within the beliefs, desires, and actions of religious people similar values held by many non-religious people. I had gone in with optimism and excitement. At the time, I was both an atheist and an intern for Interfaith Youth Corps, an organization that helps mobilize young people to change the public narrative on religion from one of conflict to one of cooperation by engaging in dialogue around shared values and collaborative action. Because of my work, I felt I was in a particularly good position to discuss religion in the lives of non-religious folks. I pictured myself saying with a well-meaning grin, hey, I work with religious people every day, and my atheism is stronger than ever. I hoped I might even serve as a bridge between two communities that are often so pitted against one another, to offer my insights as a non-religious person working in an interfaith environment. That aspiration was quickly curtailed. Throughout the program, religion and religious people were roundly mocked, decried, and denied. I'd arrived hoping to find a community bound by ethical and humanitarian ideals. Instead, I felt isolated and sorely discouraged. Though I was disheartened by the event, I went to the post-panel reception held at one of the panelists' apartments, because I hoped that if I spoke with more of the group members, I'd find some people who shared my opinions or learn a bit more about why they believed so differently than I did. At the reception, I sat down on the couch, carefully balancing a mint julep in one hand and a plate of hors d'oeuvres I couldn't name in the other. Next to me on the couch were a woman in her mid-40s with a shimmering peacock brooch and a man in his late 30s wearing a denim shirt and a tan corduroy vest. I introduced myself and asked what they'd thought of the panel. They raved. Wasn't it wonderful how intelligent the panelists were and how wickedly they'd exposed the frauds of religion? Weren't they right that we must all focus our energy on bringing about the demise of religious myths? I paused, debating whether I should say something. My Minnesota nice inclination warned me to let it be, but I had to say something. So I started small, asking them to consider that diversity of thought and background fosters an environment where discourse thrives, where ideas are exchanged, and where we learn from one another. I was stonewalled. "We have the superior perspective. Everyone else is lost," said the woman with a flick of her hand that suggested she was swatting an invisible mosquito. As a former evangelical Christian, these words were hauntingly familiar, and they represented a kind of sure-handed certainty and dismissal, a kind of fundamentalist thinking, really, that I'd hoped to leave behind with my born-again beliefs. Our conversation continued, and I offered up petitions that the positive contributions of religious people be considered with equal weight alongside the negative. "I understand what you're saying," I said, trying to weigh my words carefully, "but how can we discount the role religious beliefs played in motivating the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. or Mahatma Gandhi?" "Oh, I get it," the man jumped in with a sneer. "You're one of those atheists." I wasn't sure what he meant, but it didn't sound like a good thing. "What do you mean, one of those atheists?" "You're not a real atheist. We've got a name for people like you. You're a Fathiest." Not a real atheist. I'd heard words like that before in my youth when I was told I couldn't be a real Christian because I was gay. Once again, I didn't fit the prescribed model, and I was not so gently shown the door. Now, atheism is a bit different from Christianity in that atheism isn't a belief system. It's an identification marker that unifies a minority of Americans who do not believe in God. But the implication was clear. You're at the wrong party, kid. All right, seventh inning stretch. I invite you to rise in body or spirit to sing our second hymn, "Where My Free Spirit Onward Leads." So the author of the book, or the author of the reading and the book on which it's based, Chris Stedman, was born about 30 years ago in the Twin Cities area of Minnesota. He had made that rare accomplishment, having published a memoir at the ripe old age of 25. He was actually raised in a secular household, but he converted to evangelical Christianity at the age of 11 because he was seeking community, support, and stability during his parents' divorce. And Chris was all in when it came to Bible study and youth group activities and prayer and fasting, and he had all of the right Christian t-shirts and swag and accessories. It was definitely a way of life and a lifestyle for him. But as the years of his adolescence progressed, Chris slowly came to realize that he was gay, something his youth study Bible had some particularly condemning things to say about. So he resisted his sexual orientation and withdrew from the world, experiencing all of the fear, self-loathing, and struggle associated with an LGBT person trying to reconcile two irreconcilable things: their sexual identity and evangelical Christianity. After much anguish and contemplation of suicide, Chris's non-religious mother, out of her concern for her bright and happy son, now living in despair and depression, read his journal. To Chris's amazement, she quickly affirmed her love for and acceptance of him and shuttled him off to speak with an open-minded Lutheran minister who proceeded to tell him that there are people who care about you a whole lot, like your mom, and who love you just the way God made you. They don't want you to change, and neither does God. As you can imagine, Chris Stedman had a lot of free thinking to do when it came to religion and to God. He still believed in God, but he wondered why God would let him suffer for years under the ideas of one particularly and not universally shared interpretation of the Bible. He began to see God as either malevolent or detached and uncaring. And at first, he really had no desire to go back to church. But yet, within time, Chris joined a Lutheran church youth group, one that his older sister had been attending. And this was not perfect, but much, much more accepting. There he met his first gay youth leader, and Chris eventually became a self-described, energetic, queer Christian activist. After high school, Chris headed to a Lutheran college, where he hoped to study to become a minister, thinking that he could draw on his experiences of being othered as a gay youth and man in order to work with those on the margins of society. Although his commitment to service was sound, he soon found his religious beliefs to be on shaky ground. Chris never expected to stop believing in God. In fact, he wanted to believe in God, but his religious studies in college, as they often do, encouraged more and more theological questioning. It was Christian compassion and the social justice ethic he loved and wanted to practice. It wasn't so much about the theism. He was heartbroken when he finally realized that he no longer believed in God. He says, "It was as if I had come home from an especially long week at work to find that God had packed up his things and moved out days before without leaving a forwarding address. And I'd just been too busy to notice his absence." His atheism didn't arise out of anger or serve as a reaction against any religious communities or negative experiences he had. As he studied religion, he reflected on the arguments for and against the existence of God and was just underwhelmed by the evidence. It became apparent that believing in a divine force simply didn't resonate with his experiences or how he understood the world. Now, Chris didn't jump right into calling himself an atheist right away. He was still a religion major, after all. He finished college after writing a bunch of very conflicted religious papers, continued his interest in community service, and he also became closely involved in a nearby community center in Minneapolis where residents, mostly Muslim immigrants from Somalia, were facing the typical urban issues of crime and poverty. And Chris built tons of relationships in this community with people he really loved. But he always steered the conversation away from religion, never wanting to engage about it. And although he had come to atheism slowly and very thoughtfully, Chris was still harboring resentment about the pain and othering of his religious past. But after several years, sensing he was missing out on deep connections and relationships, he eventually decided his withdrawal from religious conversation was a mistake. It kept him from knowing the whole of the people he was helping and organizing with and hanging out with on a daily basis. He realized that he had been stunted by the pain of his negative religious experiences, and that it was this pain keeping him from openly engaging in religious conversations with the diverse people he met through his service and through his activism. He saw he was missing opportunities to learn and grow and collaborate on shared values, because these values were often never discussed. He became clear that he needed to change his attitude regarding religious people, that it was holding him back in his relationships, his work, and his personal development, and it actually ran counter to his own personal ethic of connection and of service. He soon felt driven to take action to bridge the divide between the non-religious and the religious. And of course, how does one do this? What does an atheist seeking to engage with religious people do next? Well, again, he went to theology school. He went to theology school at Meadville Lombard, my proud alma mater, because of its religious and non-religious inclusiveness, and because its relationship with the University of Chicago, which has one of the best theological schools in the world. It's there where he wrestled with and learned to translate religious ideas into a secular framework. And he also began to work with the Interfaith Youth Corps, an iconic organization funded by a Muslim named Eboo Patel, which was founded to develop interfaith understanding between youth through dialogue and joint community service. And through this process, Chris Stedman began to further formulate and articulate his personal belief system. He found humanism, and it really resonated. He geeked out reading the various editions of the Humanist Manifesto that have been written throughout the decades, and especially its definition that humanism is a progressive philosophy of life that without supernaturalism affirms our ability and responsibility to lead ethical lives of personal fulfillment that aspire to greater good of humanity. He and some atheist friends formed the Secular Humanist Alliance of Chicago. They had service projects, hosted dialogue events with the Muslim community, and wrote blogs and built their own intentional community. Chris associates his humanist atheism with action, optimism, and fulfillment, celebrating the good in everyone, encouraging acts of love and compassion, and seeking to understand rather than to dismiss. He had finally found a personal identity that mapped to his own personal convictions. And there are many insights to be gained from Chris's story. There is a definite parallel between the certitude he sought as a conflicted fundamentalist Christian and the certitude he sought as a conflicted anti-religious atheist. In both cases, his desire for certainty came at the expense of the other group's humanity. His story is also one about identity. For much of his life, Chris did not bring his full self to the table. First, as a closeted Christian, and then when he was biased against religious people because of the wounds he had sustained in his religious life. Unable to be honest about who he was, he built up walls that simply served to distance him from others. They prevented others from knowing him and having their assumptions regarding queer people and atheists challenged. He describes his growth from the activism of his adolescence, marked by self-righteousness, to now knowing how to meet people halfway, or even further. He says he has stopped seeing people as members of categories he doesn't belong to. So telling this Chris Stedman story to Unitarian Universalists brings up some kind of specific things to think about today. I mean, after all, within the confines of our own religion, we have theists and atheists and agnostics and all types, polytheists. And here in this stew, we try to provide a safe and healthy environment for the coexistence of various theological and non-religious views. We're sort of like an interfaith faith. But of course, that doesn't mean we always do it well and we always get it right. The atheist-theist debate is still well underway in some of our congregations. even despite our written and voted on and codified shared values and principles that are pretty much theologically independent. Yet still, people have this occasional urge to fight the theological battle. What words do we use in worship? Do we use the word worship? Do we pray, or do we meditate, or do we just contemplate? And sometimes people take sides on these things. And with so much work for good that needs to be done in our world, these debates kind of seem to me like a big waste of time and energy. If asked, I think Chris Stedman would tell us to get over ourselves and just get to work. In the Chris Stedman story, I've also found the ongoing theme of relationship. Mark Morrison Reed talked about it a couple of weeks ago. With whom are you in relationship? This need to put our relationship above doctrine, above theology, above personal opinion, and most importantly, the need to be right. You know, there's some reason this devout atheist, Chris Stedman, kept gravitating toward the religious. Over and over, you can see it over, he keeps going back, over and over and over again. And I think it was because he loved the relationships. Yes, he replicated the communities of the religious communities in secular activities and secular groups. But yet it's still the religious groups where you can easily find huge numbers of values-driven people who are mobilized to serve others. And writing off these massive groups is truly, truly ill-advised for everyone. Of course, you know, I don't want to paint too rosy a picture here about doing interreligious work. To engage in dialogue, one has to listen and has to have found a partner who is willing to listen. And treating others with dignity and respect is a prerequisite. And not everyone out there is ready or willing or able to do this. But that's no reason not for some of us to try, because it's the relationships, that person-to-person magic, that make the difference and allow connections to happen. You know, you can quote sacred scripture or lecture about science until you're blue in the face. It might make you feel righteous, but it won't draw you any closer to someone who's coming at it from the other side. It's when you know someone else's struggles and challenges and loves, when you see something of yourself in them, that's when our kinship in humanity is truly recognized. So it's really relationship that is what gets us past the politics and past the doctrine. We gain understanding beyond assumptions and stereotypes, beyond what you see on the news, beyond what your parents and your teachers and your preachers even told you. Interfaith relations are hard. Interfaith and no faith relations are even harder. But I can guarantee you a couple of things. It won't always go well. You may get your feelings hurt. You may be frustrated. You might even hurt someone else's feelings. You will probably be uncomfortable at times and possibly even sweaty. But if you reach out and ask those curious questions about how a person's faith might give them comfort, make sense of their life, or challenge them to walk in the world with more generosity and more compassion, it's usually most assuredly a story worth hearing, even if you don't agree with the answers. May this be so. Our closing words today are from Tom Shade. My friends, there is power at work in the universe. It works through human hands, but it was not made by human hands. It is a creative, sustaining, and transforming power, and we can trust that power with our lives. It will sustain us whenever we take a stand on the side of love, whenever we take a stand for peace and justice, whenever we take a risk. Trust in that power. Together, we are held by that power. My friends, go in peace, walk in beauty, and blessed be.
Great job, everybody. I'll see you in a while. And Kathy was right next to me. She put that coat on and
This one, I'm also not
What are these ones? I learned what something today. No. Like their mother died. My mother had cancer. They are all out. She was like, Christine, scooping it up, jumping it up.
What are you trying to do? Yeah, it's still on.
Is it still on? Is it
Yeah,
still on?
it's still on.
It's still on? How is this one throw?
No, not listening to it.
Still on? Still on? This is still on?
Hello.
Still on. It's still on.